if people like all of that chaos, then vote against the initiative because it's not for you. But for that wide swath of Idahoans, including the traditional Republicans, I mean, they are sick and tired of it, of the chaos and the fighting and the fussing and the outrage and fear that is stoked by some of these folks who are just trying to get votes.
Jim Jones, how are you, sir?
Just dandy.
Dandy. You're somebody who I've been wanting to be able to meet with and speak with for some time. You were Chief Justice of the Idaho Supreme Court, and you were on the court for about 8 years. Was it 8 years?
12 years.
12 years. You were also the Attorney General of the state of Idaho for 8 years.
That was 8. Right.
That was the 8. You are here today. The Prop 1 is obviously a very, very hot topic for people. You have a large swath of the Republican Party that's very much against it. And then you have a swath of the Republican Party that is actually for it. And you're part of the crew that is in favor of Prop 1. You obviously bring a unique perspective in that you have carried the highest legal elected office in the state of Idaho. And so I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are on Prop 1 with the open primaries and ranked choice voting.
Well, I can tell you this. It will make a tremendous change in how we conduct our politics here in Idaho. You know, when I was AG, I worked with Democrat governors. I was a Republican. I worked with Cecil Andrus and John Evans. And we had a little dust up here and there, no doubt about it. But when it came to doing the people's work, to doing things that mattered, I worked with them hand in glove, particularly John Evans. We had a water problem when it looked like the Supreme Court had essentially handed control of the Snake River to Idaho Power Company with their water right at the Swan Falls Dam. The governor was against it because he knew it was going to impact everybody upstream. I did too. We didn't advertise our alliance, but we worked hand in glove with people in the legislature. Half of the legislature was on one side and half on the other. And we fought the power company to a draw after 2 years. And it couldn't have happened unless we had worked across the aisle. And you don't have any of that anymore. You have people who are pushing culture war agendas that have nothing to do with what happens here in Idaho. They win office through the closed Republican primary. You can win the primary with as little as 8.8% of the registered voters in your district.
How do you mean that?
Well, in the primary, it's low turnout, number one. Number two, the people who are on the extremes put all of their eggs in that primary basket, and they get their troops out. They use, fear and outrage on all of these fake issues, and they can beat a good, responsible Republican. People like Jeff Eggenbrod and Linda Hartgen down in Twin Falls, and there's nothing you can do about it. They win their primary with a low turnout, and then they go on to the general election, and with that R behind their name, they're going to win. What we want to do is to give reasonable Republicans, traditional Republicans, a reasonable chance to get around that primary system and have the selection of who represents the district made in the general election. And you do that with what we call the top 4 open primary, where the candidates, all of them are on the same ticket. Everybody gets to vote on them. I mean, these are all taxpayers. Everybody should have a chance to weigh in on who's going to represent them. And then those 4, or as many as sign up, it could be 2, could be 3, could be 4, they all go on the general election ballot, and you pick your favorite, just like you do now. But then you have the option of ranking the other 3, or however many others there are, in your order of preference. And so if your first choice doesn't get it, it's possible that your second choice might. And the way they tally the votes is if anybody gets 50% or more in the first count, that person wins. Like up in Alaska, the governor, when they went through the ranked choice process, got over 50%, and he was in like Flynn.
The Alaskan ranked choice voting system is something that was brought up in former interviews, and I really wanted to make it clear because I actually looked up the numbers of how this broke down, because the narrative has been that Sarah Palin would have won because she got the most first place votes, but Begich, the other Republican who got third place, he got eliminated, and then the Democrat outweighed Sarah Palin. That's actually not true. What happened in that vote is the person that got the most first place votes was actually the Democrat, followed by Sarah Palin, followed by Begich, the third place. When Begich dropped out, they redistributed the second place votes to Sarah Palin and the Democrat again had the most votes. So the Democrat had the most votes in the straight election of who got the most in first place, and the Democrat got the most votes for in the ranked choice voting calculation. But again, it needs to be clear because it has been articulated that the ranked choice voting did wrong by Alaska and that they wouldn't have had a Democratic governor. But in reality, again, and I can pop it up on the screen, in reality, the Democrat in the first round got the most first place votes.
Yeah, well, that's true. And, Sarah Palin could have won that election if she had told people, if you don't choose me for your first choice, choose me for your second. But what she did is say, I don't want you to choose me for your second choice. So she put herself out of the running beyond the first round of the count. Secondly, she was viewed by a lot of Alaskans as not serious, as having ditched the governorship to run for vice president, and as a former governor of the state of Idaho said, she was just an unappealing candidate. And she and Begich spent their campaign shooting at each other. And the Democrat, who had worked with the legislature across the aisle on Native issues and had a good reputation, did a good campaign. She talked about the issues, and she won.
What you said just now, and you also touched on it earlier, the concept of reaching across the aisle and working with people. This used to be something that made an appealing candidate. RFK, the former presidential candidate and now, supporting Trump, articulated that his uncle and his dad were both very much work with everybody people, that they drew out voters from both sides of the aisle, and they were kind of champions of the people, as the Democratic Party used to, kind of term itself, that, they were supporting the blue collars. That now is an unappealing, or marketed as an unappealing factor. If, for instance, in the Eagle election for mayor, Eagle mayoral election, there were 4 people originally. The lowest 2 were dropped out after the original first election in November. The remaining 2 went to a runoff in December. And it came out that Mayor Pike, who's now mayor, was being supported by, and I don't mean it came out like it was some secret, but people were saying, hey, before you vote, you need to take into consideration that Brad Pike, who is then the council president, is being supported by the Democratic Party. Right now, mind you, this was a nonpartisan race. So, and Brad Pike is a lifelong Republican, and it was being used, the fact that he appealed to both Republicans and Democrats was being used against him by people saying, you should take this into consideration when you're voting, that like the Democrats want him to win. So think about that. And that to me, like, really gave me pause. Now, I'm not an Eagle voter, so it's not like I was just watching this thinking like, gosh, isn't that what, like, theoretically people are supposed to want, that we're supposed to all kind of work together? Or is it that I appeal to this party and this party only, and that makes me a better candidate?
You know, there's no law against a candidate running for public office appealing to people of both parties. I have to admit, I ran for Congress against George Hanson in 1978 in the Republican primary, and I knew it was a hard slog, and I looked to people like union folks, Democrats, anybody who had the ability to vote in an election, and worked with them. I said, you know, I'm not going to be on your side on this, that, and the other issue. I told the guys over in Pocatello in the union, I am against, forced unionism. I support right to work, but I said, I'll be your candidate for every other thing that is important to you, you know, if I can do it. And that's really, I think, fair game. A lot of people do that, and they don't let you know that they're doing it. I didn't particularly advertise it. But there are so many issues where you can have common ground with people, and just one issue shouldn't put those voters out of your purview. You ought to work for everybody, because we're all paying for it. We're all part of the system. And when you villainize people in the other party, that's entirely wrong. For Prop 1, for somebody to consider voting yes on Prop 1, there has to be an assumed agreement. Voting yes on Prop 1 presupposes the existence of a problem that you're trying to fix. A lot of people that are very vehemently against Prop 1 do not agree that there is a problem. That's the whole nature. It's like, why are you fixing this? That, like, I don't even agree that there's something to fix. Why are you changing it? What is the problem as you see it with that Prop 1 is trying to fix? If people are happy with the mayhem that takes place in the legislature each year, the addressing of culture war issues that have no bearing on what we do in Idaho, like banning books, proposing legislation to criminalize cannibalism, all of those things that people fight about, giving public money to private and religious schools. We shouldn't even have to be talking about that, because the state was not set up to subsidize private and religious education. It's specifically prohibited in our Constitution. Critical race theory. We don't have any critical race theory here in Idaho. I mean, it's not being taught in the schools. But, they fight these continual wars, and we're in the legislature trying to beat out these brush fires time and time again. If people like all of that chaos, then vote against the initiative, because it's not for you. But for that wide swath of Idahoans, including the traditional Republicans, I mean, they are sick and tired of it, of the chaos and the fighting and the fussing and the outrage and fear that is stoked by some of these folks who are just trying to get votes. If people want to change, and I recruited well over 100 traditional Republicans, including Butch Otter, Greg Casey, Denton Darrington, people who are sick and tired of the fussing and fighting, and they are on what my little group calls the Republicans for Open Primaries. They want to put an end to it and get back to business where we actually work on problems like the big problem we have right now over in eastern Idaho on water rights. That makes a major impact. Whatever happens in that fight's going to have a major impact on our economy here in Idaho. Let's deal with that. Make our schools better. get our bridges and roads fixed up without having to rely on all this federal money. You know, we can do some of this on our own. There are so many problems that we can work with and, make life better here in Idaho if we just attend to business like we used to. Like it was when I was AG back in the 80s. People work together. They don't do it anymore. They hate each other. And that's not right. And you don't get anything done. It just tears down the system.
Man, you said a lot. So it's, in your mind, it's a distraction from in your mind, the real issue is that people use culture war items to garner votes, and they spend their time talking about these items in order to continue reinforcing their voting public that they voted for the right thing, while neglecting broader issues like water scarcity or obviously we have water, but the water rights that are being determined, the dwindling down of the resources in the Snake Plains aquifer. I mean, like all of those things affecting farmers. That actually came into, what's interesting about that one is that came into view for a lot of people because there was a guy, Matt Attack 009, I believe his name is, who made a couple social media clips and claimed that it was the federal government using defense funding to fund cobalt mines that were using 500,000 gallons of water a day or something. And I had TJ Budge, who is the attorney representing the pump farmers, on actually to explain the problem because, again, Matt's an idiot. I don't know what's going on. And he was like, all right, he was great. He was actually in a minivan. I think it was a minivan, like in a dentist parking lot on his cell phone. I was so pleased that he was kind enough to take the time to do this. Cause I mean, he lives 4 hours away. We weren't able to connect in person, but he explained this whole thing. It was like, there are no cobalt mines on the Snake Plains aquifer that anybody knows about. Like that's not a thing, but it became this hot, it for a moment became a culture war topic because people were upset that the federal government was funding the destruction of farmland, or they were upset that the federal government was potentially funding the destruction of farmland in Idaho. So it came into the purview of people fighting against the federal government, when the reality is it's much more, first off, it's much more complicated because you have to deal with senior versus junior water rights. You're dealing with surface water rights versus pump water rights. You're dealing with an aquifer and surface system that were at one point regulated separately and then came under under one umbrella, spring water coming out of like this whole big thing, right? I mean, it took like an hour for him to explain it to me, but those types of things only became popular for a hot second when it kind of moved into the social media culture war against the federal government. But aside from that, very few people know anything about it. And somebody just asked me the other day, they're like, what's up with those cobalt mines? I'm like, oh my God, it's not cobalt mines, man. So it's interesting how much it takes to get people's attention on those issues.
Well, what's interesting about the water issue that you just brought up is when we had that big fight with Idaho Power Company, one of the things that we agreed on was that we were going to do a full adjudication of the Snake River Basin. And that happened, and it took years and years and lots of money. But we got everybody's water rights quantified and prioritized, including the federal government's. The federal government can't come in and just claim a bunch of water for this, that, or the other. They've got to go through state law procedures. And so, what we accomplished in the adjudication is to keep that kind of thing that you're talking about from happening.
Keep the federal government from coming in and making some determination about something happening.
Yeah. And, people only get excited about something nowadays, it seems like, when somebody gives misinformation. And what we're hoping to do is to kind of nip that in the bud, give everybody a chance to vote on who serves in public office, including the military folks. I served my country in Vietnam, and I'm part of a group called the Veterans for Idaho Voters, who take a strong position in support of the initiative because their feeling is if they serve their country, if they're an independent, they should have a right to vote in any election that is supported and paid for by the taxpayers. And we have people, like Marv Hagedorn, who was the fellow in charge of the Veterans Agency here in Idaho, who was a fairly conservative Republican in the legislature, but he sees this as a means of giving veterans the opportunity to vote in any election they damn well please. And I think they're entitled to that.
Why? Why are they entitled to that? Because this is a question that comes up a lot, which is, why should you be able to vote for my team? Right?
Well, when the taxpayers are paying for your team's election, that gives every taxpayer the ability, I think, to play in that election. Prior to 2011, when the Republicans closed their primary, you could waltz into a voting booth and the workers would say, which election would you like to vote in? Republican, Democrat, Constitution? And you say, well, I usually vote Republican, but I want to vote Democrat this time, or the other way around. And you got the ballot and you marked all of those things. What was wrong with that? We had better politics back then. The system that we're talking about is even better than that because everybody has a chance to weigh in. And we always talk about, well, one man, one vote. Should have phrased it a little different, like one person, one vote, because, of course, when everybody was talking about that, the women didn't have the franchise that they should have had all along. But if everybody's vote is supposed to be equal, why is it that 8.8% of the voters in the Moscow area could choose who represents that district?
Explain that to me. What happened in Moscow?
Okay, so in 2022, in the Republican primary, they had a fellow named Dan Foreman running. He was really extreme to the right. Abortion is murder, and it ought to be punished with the death penalty. That's a little bit extreme.
It's a little extreme.
And he had some opponents in the primary. He got 8.8% of the vote in the primary. So with that vote, he won in the primary, went to the general election. And, of course, up in that vicinity, usually if you have an R behind your name, you're going to win. And in that same election, Brian Lenny beat Jeff Eggenbrod with just 12.7% of the vote. All of the rest of all the rest of the voters had no say, and certainly not the voters who voted in the general election. And so, you have a minority, a small minority of people who are holding on to those seats in the legislature. And what we want to do is break their monopoly on power. And they're fighting tooth and nail against this. And I would urge anybody who's interested to go on the Open Primaries Initiative website or Reclaim Idaho or Veterans for Idaho Voters and find out what this initiative can do to open up politics in Idaho to equal voting rights and to foster good government, because it will.
When you talk about what it was like before 2011, when you could roll into an election area and just say, hey, I would like to vote on the Republican ticket, I'd like to vote on the Democratic ticket, whatever it might be. The Rod Beck articulated that, hey, you have to realize if say Matt's an independent, okay, I can go into the voting booth or to the polling location, whatever it is, and say, hey, I, as an independent, would like the Republican ticket today. And they say, okay, great. And they print it out. And so I go then instantaneously from registered independent. If I were an independent, I go instantaneously from registered independent to registered Republican for that vote. And then if I like the next day or even later that day, I can re-register as an independent. So I go independent, registered Republican, back to registered independent. And in that way, Rod was saying, hey, Commissioner Beck was saying, hey, nobody's shut out from these elections. What's wrong with that system?
Well, it's like forcing somebody to be part of a group that they don't want to be. If you're a Presbyterian, and you want to have certain voice in the church, but you're a Lutheran, you have to change to a Lutheran or whatever. I don't think it was within the intent of the framers of the U.S. Constitution to force people to join any group that they didn't want to join or they felt uncomfortable being in. George Washington told us that political parties would be the end of our democracy, and he was right. He said it distorts the government, and partisanship, if you look at the Idaho Constitution, there's not a provision in that Constitution that gives any right to a political party, but it gives rights to people to vote, and it gives rights to voters generally to run an initiative of people power. The problem is that the ruling group in the legislature, all of the extreme Republicans who are there because of the Dorothy Moons and the Freedom Foundations and all that stuff, don't want you to have the right to vote generally. They don't want you to have the right to initiate legislation or to kill legislation with a referendum. They tried to kill that, making it almost impossible to initiate legislation. I was part of a group, Reclaim Idaho, and I had a group called the Committee for the Protection and Preservation of the Idaho Constitution. We filed suit in the Supreme Court and got that legislation killed. They wanted us to have to get 6% of registered voters in all of the 35 Idaho legislative districts to sign the petition to get it on the election ballot. The Idaho Supreme Court said that's a clear violation of the rights of the voters under the Idaho Constitution. We shouldn't be forced into doing anything that we don't feel is appropriate for us, for our personal beliefs. And yeah, you can go in and say, well, I'll decide to be a Republican just for this election. A lot of people don't want to do that. We're talking about Idaho folks, people who grew up independent-minded, who thought that they shouldn't be pushed around. These same people that say, well, you should be able to get pushed around to be a Republican on Election Day, but don't push me to wear a mask in an epidemic. These people don't want to be pushed around. They don't want to be told they can't take their gun to church. But by golly, they can tell us that we should be compliant if they want us to vote in the election, the only election in Idaho that counts, the primary election. Yeah, you should have to vote in the election as a Republican, regardless of whether you have no use for the party's philosophy.
Hiram Erickson mentioned that voting is a matter of public record, but I'm botching this. He didn't say that like anybody can find out what you voted for, but is party registration a matter of public record? So say I'm an independent, and just for this last primary, say there are two people running in a primary, and I like one of them, say I'm the Republican or Democratic, it doesn't matter, but I'm an independent. I'm like, I really want to vote in this primary. And I, on that day, register as a Republican or a Democrat or whatever, and then back to independent. Is party registration a matter of public record? Would somebody be able to figure out like, hey, Matt was registered for a day as a Republican or Matt was registered for a day as a Democrat?
Yes, it is public record. You can find it fairly easily by going online. Let me give you another example here. I served as a member of the Idaho Supreme Court for 12 years. Judges are ethically obligated not to engage in party politics. And we don't make public statements, or when I was a member of the court, we didn't make public statements. But if I wanted to vote for the candidate of my choice, I had to make a statement that I was a Republican, which I think conflicts with my obligation under the judicial ethics. I didn't vote in the first primary election when I was on the court because I thought my ethical responsibilities kept me from voting for any party and declaring myself a member of any party. And in the second election, when I was on the court, it was a general, well, I think it was a primary. I felt very strongly about who was running for a particular office. I wanted to have a say. I was a former Republican. I gave up my party affiliation back in 2002. But the Judicial Council came up with some cockamamie opinion saying, well, it's all right if you do. So I thought, well, I'll just do it. And so I registered as a Republican. I felt like I was violating my ethical responsibilities, but they said it was all right. But you shouldn't be in that position. Other people have other objections to being forced to declare some affiliation with a group they don't like or they don't agree with. And we didn't do it before. Why should we allow that to happen now? It only fosters the partisanship that's ripped our state and our country apart. We need to, kind of leave the partisan crap behind and sort of work together as Idahoans and Americans to try to get things done. And there are a lot of things that need to be done that just sort of sit by the wayside in all of this partisanship.
When you talk about one person, one vote, I don't understand that this is an objection or just a topic that people bring up. In the ranked choice voting system, I don't have two votes, right? Like my first place and my second place vote can't be simultaneously counted, right? Like if I vote, say I vote for Jim Jones, you're my number one. And then Steve over there, he's my number two. And, Brandy, she's my number three, whatever. If you're my number one and you survive the first round, then my second and third place votes don't get counted, right? Like my vote just sticks with you. Am I understanding that correctly? Because I know people bring this up. I'm like, I don't understand what they mean by one person, one vote. Like my vote stays with you if you win. And if you lose, then my vote from you is liberated, right? And my second place or third place vote gets put in place.
Yeah, your vote in the ranked choice system can only be counted once. You have one vote. And the beauty of it is if that one vote was for a candidate that had no chance of winning or, who got the lowest amount in the first count, then your vote moves to the second choice you made. So your first choice may not make it, but your second choice might. You only had one vote. What I'm talking about on the one man, one vote situation is that your vote should have an equal weight with everybody else's. And that was the whole decision, the whole rationale behind the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1964 that said everybody's vote should count on an equal basis. And they said you couldn't gerrymander. so that these people over here got 80% value out of their vote, and these other people only got a 20% value. That you should have equal weight with other voters. And in the ranked choice system, you do. In the system that these folks want to perpetuate, where only 8.8% of the voters can select who gets chosen eventually for the office, their vote counts a hell of a lot more than the other 90-some% voters who didn't have an opportunity to vote for somebody of their choice.
About the campaign for Prop 1 in general, there has been a lot of criticism about the discussion on open primaries and that discussion of open primaries dominating the conversation or education to potential voters, and very little talking about ranked choice voting. And that was, in fact, a criticism I think that our Attorney General brought up, which is, hey, this is a bait and switch. Or, Commissioner Beck did say that. He was like, look, they're talking about open primaries. They're not talking about ranked choice voting. Why have these two? Is there a benefit to doing open primaries coupled with ranked choice voting that is superior to just doing open primaries? Because again, you and I here are talking a lot about open primaries, and we're talking less about ranked choice voting. Frankly, it seems like ranked choice voting seems like a less in-depth conversation because it's not really philosophical. It's just effectively just an automatic runoff system. The city of Eagle has a runoff system. Somebody has to get, 51% of the vote or greater. And if you don't, you eliminate whoever, go down to the last two and you have a runoff. It doesn't seem that complex to me, but why have the ranked choice voting in here? Why have it coupled in with the open primaries?
Well, we have called it from time to time an instant runoff. Right at the start of this, the Attorney General was tasked with the responsibility under the statute to give it reasonable ballot titles that would describe what it was. He gave some very deceptive ballot titles. We had to take him to court. The court made him change it. We didn't get it described as we had hoped it would. But what we wanted everybody to know that this gets rid of the closed primary, because that is the real problem we've got in our government. And so I think that's probably why we call it the Open Primaries Initiative. Nobody was trying to hide the fact that then there's got to be a tabulation process. But the main thrust of this was to get rid of the closed primary, which has been the bane of our existence. It's not the same as the open primary that we had before 2011, because that was an open political primary where each party had a ticket and you chose which ticket you wanted, but you had to vote the full ballot of that ticket.
Oh, so you were reduced down to only, if I wanted to vote for one of the Republicans, then I would have to only vote for Republican items on that ticket. I couldn't vote for a Republican and then vote for a Democratic initiative or something like that.
Right. So that was an open primary, an open political primary. The court said, well, when they were looking at the ballot titles, this open primary thing is not the same as that, so you don't want to have that confused. And so they called it the top four primary. And probably it would have better been described as the totally open primary, because you're opening the whole thing up, where everybody runs on the same ticket, every voter votes on that ticket. Or you could have called it the open nonpartisan primary or something like that. But, we're kind of stuck because we were not the ones that made the ballot titles. That started with Labrador, and then we had to take him to court, and they opened it up a little bit. But in any event, everything I've always written, and I've written a lot of stuff about this dang thing, I always talk about the ranked choice system because it's kind of new. You know, it's one of those things, you know, you're telling your kid to eat that broccoli and they're thinking, well, I don't know if I like the looks of that stuff. And it's not that simple. I mean, it's not that complicated because the thing is, nowadays when you go into the voting booth in the primary election, you vote for your favorite. Well, in the Open Primaries Initiative, you walk into the voting booth and there are all of these candidates there. You vote for your favorite. Now, that's not much more difficult than what we've got now. In the general election, the top 4 people, the top 4 vote getters are going to be on that ballot. And so then you say, I'm going to vote for my favorite. That's all you have to do. I'm not going to mess with these other 3 or how many there are on the ballot. And that's, you know, pretty simple. If you wish, you can rank the other 3 in your order of preference. That way, you know, if the top guy doesn't get it that you voted for, then your second choice goes up into that position as the number 1. And, you know, to me, I see that as a big benefit. If you go to the general election nowadays and you vote for one and that person doesn't get it, you're out of the game. So anyway, they say, well, voters are not smart enough to do that. Well, I think they're smart enough to count to 4. And they can do it in Ireland, which has had it for decades and decades, or Australia, or Maine, or a bunch of the cities down in Utah. They have ranked choice, and they're happy with it. It works well. And I think our voters are every bit as smart as those. So I think it works well, and nobody's hiding the fact that, you know, there's a way of calculating that's a little different in the general election, but, you know, it's actually pretty simple.
What's the utility of it? And again, I don't mean to hammer, like, I understand what you're saying about the totally open or extremely open primary, however you want to articulate that, but why not maintain the same tabulation system that we have now?
Well, here's the thing. Take the Alaska situation. Peralta dealt with the issues. She didn't deal in personalities. She didn't hammer each of the other candidates. The 2 Republicans beat the crap out of each other and invoked a bunch of culture war stuff, and they didn't get rewarded by the voters. Peralta got rewarded by the voters because she stuck to the issues and was civil and made sense. What we find in areas where you have ranked choice, people have to be more civil. They have to run campaigns that are issue-driven instead of, you know, all this fussing and fighting and fear and outrage. They cause people to be more attractive. You get the candidate who is most supported by the voters when you have the ranked choice system, because you're not going to make any headway if you're pushing an extreme agenda. You've got to broaden your support, try to get more people interested in your candidacy. You can't do that by whacking the other people over the head with a blunt instrument. But you can if you try to use reason, if you try to use civility, if you try to appeal to voters' desire to have real problems addressed. And, I talked to a fellow from up in Alaska. His part of his family's Democrat and part is Republican. He said it has had a tremendously beneficial effect in Alaska politics. You're still getting a majority of Republicans in the legislature, which you would hear, but they're people that are there to do problem solving, to be pragmatic, to try to appeal to a broader range of voters, and it's worked well. And it works well in in Maine too, which has ranked choice. There are about 6 states that are looking at it right now. Nevada approved it in 2022. They have to do it again because it's a constitutional amendment, so they're going to be voting on it. I think there will be voting on ranked choice in Arizona, Colorado. That was implemented by people on both sides of the aisle, and the legislature actually put it on the ballot. There's a variety of it that I think will be approved or disapproved in Oregon, Montana. It's starting to occur to people that this is a good way to have more civil, more pragmatic elections. And I think that's what we'll see here in Idaho.
Jim, I really appreciate you coming in today. We've talked about a myriad of things. You've answered a lot of questions. Are we missing anything?
There's one thing that I did want to bring up is on the issue of the cost of implementing ranked choice, our initiative. There's been dispute over whether it's going to be a lot of money or a little bit of money. The governor's Division of Fiscal Management, or DFM, however the wording is, calculated it when the initiative was filed at $1.6 million to get it implemented. The Secretary of State more recently has estimated that it could cost from $25 to $40 million. It all depends on whether you consider whether the software is certified or certifiable by the Secretary of State. Phil McGrain is a wonderful guy. I supported him when he ran for Secretary of State the first time around. That was a race where I had to hold my nose and, register as a Republican to support him, and I supported him the last time around. There's a disagreement that I have with Phil as to how you interpret the statute. It's a statute that talks about voting software and all that stuff. I read it, as does a fellow named Josh Daniels, who is the former clerk of Utah County, Utah. Yeah, you wouldn't have Utah County, Idaho. Utah County, Utah, who says it's certifiable under Idaho statute. He's looked at it. He's familiar with the software. It's RC Tab software. It's used in a number of jurisdictions, and it's off-the-shelf available. So it doesn't cost a lot of money. Virginia approved it, certified it for their election system, mostly for municipal elections, but they certified it as being a good software, under a Republican governor. And so we believe that we can get the system certified and implemented, as Mr. Daniels has said, under our statute. If our statute is not conducive to it in the Secretary of State's view, we can get the statute amended easily to change that. So we think that the guesstimate that was subsequently made is way high. And, even if it wasn't, the legislature has shown itself to be bent on giving public money to private and religious schools to the tune of at least $50 million. I would say it's more important to spend money of that magnitude on giving everybody the right to vote, in making sure that everybody in the state of Idaho has an equal voice in our government, as opposed to throwing money down the rat hole to subsidize private education and religious education. So, on any count, even if the secretary is correct or whether he's off the mark, it's an expenditure that is well worthwhile.
Jim, thank you for coming in, sir. I appreciate you. Thank you for doing what you're doing to, fight for what you think is right in Idaho. I will be having, hopefully, Phil McGrain on to talk about his position with financing. Thank you for bringing that up. I hadn't thought about chatting with you about it. And again, I'm really trying to present both sides so people can get a really clear view of what this is. They can determine if they feel like there is actually an issue that needs to be acted on, or if they think everything is hunky-dory. Thank you for coming in and taking the time to present your side. I appreciate it.
Sure enough. Glad to.